I'm Miss Crane. I'm going to be reading Chapter 5 of Adventure According to Humphrey. I hope you've read the first 4 chapters so that you know where we're at. The trip to Treasure Island. My classmates weren't the only humans acting strangely. One night, instead of saying his usual, "Never fear, 'cause Aldo's here," our custodian threw open the door and shouted, "Ahoy there, me hearties!" I peeked out of my sleeping hut, half expecting to see a real pirate with a patch over his eye and a sack full of doubloons, though I wasn't quite sure what those were. Instead, I saw my old pal Aldo staring into my cage. "Are you in there, matey?" he asked. Yes, and you certainly fooled me," I squeaked. When he threw back his head and laughed, his mustache shook so hard I thought it might fall off. Luckily, Aldo's mustache is firmly attached. "You be all right, Jack?" he replied, even though he knows perfectly well my name is Humphrey. "I be here to swab the decks, and don't ye be worrying. I'm not a real pirate," he said. "Not yet, anyway," he added with a wink. That comment got my whiskers wiggling. I can tell you. Did he mean he might become a pirate someday? He didn't explain what he meant, just whistled a merry tune I'd never heard before. After he cleaned the floor and emptied the wastebasket, he stood in front of my cage and said, "Check this out." He danced a very happy, bouncy kind of dance as he whistled his tune. When he was finished, he bowed and said, "That's a hornpipe dance. It's named after a musical instrument sailors play. What do you think, Humphrey?" I was happy he remembered my name again, and even happier to be able to squeak the truth. It was great, great, great. "Thanks, matey. Gotta set sail now." With that, he pushed his cleaning cart out of room 26. It was very quiet once he was gone, so quiet that I couldn't help remembering the thing he'd said about not being a pirate yet. Since Aldo was one of the nicest people I'd ever met, it was hard to think of him as a person who would steal people's treasure, which is what real pirates do. Still, with his fine mustache and excellent hornpipe dancing, I could almost believe he was a pirate. I couldn't sleep a wink that night, not just because I'm nocturnal, but also because of all the strange goings on. Og, if I could go to the library, maybe I'd understand what everyone is talking about, I told my neighbor. Og floated in the water side of his tank as if he didn't have a care in the world. I flung open the door to my cage and came a little closer. "Wouldn't you like to know what's going on?" I squeaked loudly, just in case he hadn't heard me before. He didn't answer at all. He just floated around. Maybe he was sleeping, but who can tell with a frog? "I was thinking maybe I should go down there and check things out," I said, raising my voice even more. Still nothing from Og. Since I was already out of my cage, I decided to have a little adventure. Aldo would have gone home by now, so the coast would be clear. I slid down the leg of the table and scurried across the floor. The door was closed, sure, but I was able to squeeze under the bottom. After all, I'd done this before. The hallways of Longfellow School are always a little eerie at night. There are low lights on, and the street lights shine through some of the windows, but it's odd to be in a school with no children, no teachers, and no principal. It doesn't feel quite right. I hurried to the library, squeezed under the door, whoops, a little tight, and there was the marvelous room filled with books. At first it was scary, 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 because the fish tank had its lights blazing, so it glowed in a way that was pretty, but kind of ghostly. The colorful fish swam around in the bright blue water, and luckily they didn't look scary at all. It was cool in the library. Maybe Mrs. Wright was right about the temperature being off. I walked up the big aisle between the shelves and the tables and stared at the tank. The sunken ship was still there, and I have to admit it fascinated me. Whose ship was it? A tiny pirate? A hamsterish fish? Or some creature of the deep I'd never heard of? I crept a little closer to get a better look. There was a series of shelves next to the desk. I found that if I reached up and pulled hard with all my might, I could raise myself from shelf to shelf until I reached the top of the desk. The light blazing from the fish tank blinded me for a second. And as I stumbled across the desktop, I stepped on something hard and lumpy. Like magic, a big screen in the front of the room lit up. I scrambled over the bumpy object and whoa! Pictures came up on the screen and music blared. I looked down and realized that I was standing on the remote control with all kinds of buttons. one of which had turned on the television. But I forgot all about the remote when exciting music began to play, and I looked up at the TV screen, and what I saw up there amazed me. The words on the screen spelled out Treasure Island. I am so glad I learned to read. There was the sea and a ship and a boy named Jim Hawkins. Before I knew it, I was watching an amazing adventure starring a pirate known as Long John Silver. Oh, and there was a pirate that squawked, "Pieces of eight, pieces of eight," even louder than AJ had. The bird had a sharp, pointy beak that I would never want to come into contact with. And there was great big waves rolling up and down, up and down. As I settled down to watch, I accidentally hit another button, and the movie started all over again. The words, the music, the parrot, and the waves rolling up and down until my tummy felt funny. This time I didn't wiggle a whisker. I sat quietly and watched the whole movie from beginning to end. It was one of the best nights I could remember, at least at Longfellow School. When it was over, I carefully tapped the remote control until the picture went off. Then I dashed back to room 26, grabbed the cord for the blinds that hangs down next to my table, and swung myself back up like I was swinging my way up to the crow's nest of a ship. The crow's nest is a lookout at the top of a ship. I learned that watching Treasure Island. Soon I was back in my cage, safe and secure. "Ahoy, Og! Would you like to hear about Treasure Island?" I asked my friend. "Boing, boing," he answered. I took that to be a very big yes. It took me most of the night to tell Og the whole story of the movie I'd seen. If I do say so myself, I did a great job, especially when I screeched, "Pieces of eight, pieces of eight." Whenever I did that, Og responded with an enthusiastic boing, boing. The next morning, once class was underway again, I was dozing away, dreaming about a desert island. This wasn't just any desert island, because in addition to the swaying palms and the ocean breezes, Miss Mac was there with me. Oh, and we had such fun, eating dates and nuts and playing in the sand, which I must admit I like better than water. In my dream, I heard roaring waves, screeching seagulls, the singing of the ocean breeze. Then there was the sound of Mrs. Brisbane. Maybe I wasn't dreaming anymore. I poked my head out of my sleeping hut. "Class, I have a big surprise for you," Mrs. Brisbane announced. "I brought in some helpers to advise you about your boats." "Woo-hoo!" AJ hooted loudly. Garth joined him. Mrs. Brisbane went to the door, and when she opened it, in came her husband, Bert, and, surprise, Gail's mom. "Remember, there's a prize for most beautiful boat and a prize for most seaworthy," said our teacher. "Mr. Brisbane can advise you on building your boats, and Mrs. Morgenstern is an artist who can help you make them look good." That news created quite a stir in class. Personally, if I were sailing, I'd want a solid seaworthy boat, but I also like the idea of a good-looking craft. Having these two helpers was just the kind of idea a very clever hamster might have come up with. All of my classmates were buzzing with excitement except for Gail, who stared down at her desk. I was puzzled. Wasn't she glad her mom was there? I decided to think about it for a while, but I guess I dozed off. The next time I woke up, Mr. Brisbane was talking. "A boat that floats is a success," he said. "A boat that sinks is not." I nodded in agreement, and then drifted back to sleep. I was awakened again by the sound of Mrs. Morgenstern's voice. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," she said. "Your job is to make your boat a joyful reflection of who you are." Suddenly, I was wide awake. The SS Golden Hamster was definitely a joyful reflection of who I was, but would a boat like that actually float? My friends were already busy drawing and discussing their boats. If only I had a partner to help me build my boat. I stuck my head outside the hut. "Og, would you like to build a boat with me?" I asked. "Boing," he answered, followed by loud splashing. I guess the idea of a boat is pretty silly to a creature that can swim like Og. So I watched my fellow classmates make their plans. Mr. Brisbane provided each group with a light wooden hull, the body of the boat, which he had hollowed out because Mrs. Brisbane said that it was too dangerous for her students to be carving with knives. He wheeled his chair from table to table, encouraging my friends about their ideas. Mr. Brisbane moves around in a wheelchair after an accident last year, but it hasn't slowed him down one bit. Mrs. Morgenstern also moved about to each group. She was wearing a green and gold flowered tunic with gold pants tucked into her red boots. Color is the key, she told Seth and Tabitha. Choose your colors carefully. The sail's the thing, Mr. Brisbane told Art and Mandy. Remember, that's what powers your boat. The Vikings were great sailors. Good choice. Vikings! My whiskers wiggled with excitement and I strained my neck, hoping for a glimpse of their drawing. Mrs. Morgenstern moved to the table where Gail was working with Heidi. Come on, Gail, she said. You can be more creative than that. Think color. Gail wasn't giggling. She wasn't even smiling. Kirk, who was almost always joking, was also very serious as he worked on his boat with his friend Richie. I've got a great idea, Kirk said as he quickly sketched a drawing. I know all about boats. We'll make it a tall ship, like this. My heart thumped a little faster. Tall ships were amazing with many, many, many sails billowing in the wind. That's cool, Richie picked up his pencil. What if we put a thing on the front, whatchamacallit? He started to draw on the paper, but Kirk reached out and stopped Richie's hand. A figurehead? I don't want to take the chance. It might throw the ship off balance and sink it. Richie stopped drawing, but he didn't look very happy. It would look good, he complained. Yep, Kirk agreed. But you want to win, right? Sure, Richie said, although he didn't sound completely convinced. Hey, Richie, what did the ocean say to the boat? Kirk asked. What? Richie asked. It didn't say anything. It just waved, Kirk joked, and Richie laughed. And then Mr. Brisbane came to their table. This is a happy group, he said. He studied the sketch of the tall ship. It's a fine-looking craft, boys, he praised them. Good work. Kirk and Richie beamed with pride. Mr. Brisbane, want to hear a joke? Asked Kirk. Mr. Brisbane smiled. Always. This time, Richie started. What did the ocean say to the boat? It didn't say anything, it just waved, Kirk responded. Then he and Richie exploded into laughter, and they were a good team. Or so I thought. Mrs. Morgenstern's voice rang out. Now that's what I call original. She was standing by the table where Saya and Miranda were working. Gail, Heidi, she said, look at this. Stunning. Heidi and Gail came over to look at the drawing. It's a swan boat, Miranda explained. I saw one once in a park. She sounded very proud. Speak up, Saya. Didn't say anything. She just looked proud too. Okay, said Heidi. We'll mark ours really pretty. Right, Gail? Gail didn't answer. She just followed her friend back to the table and stared down at her drawing. I wished I could see it from my cage, but I couldn't. After Mr. Brisbane and Mrs. Morgenstern left, Mrs. Brisbane pulled her chair to the front of the room, took out my favorite book, and began to read. Uncle Jolly Roger and Vic and Vi finally reached the tropical island where there was supposed to be a buried treasure. But when they arrived, they discovered that a band of pirates had gotten there right before them. The very thought of meeting a real pirate gave me the shivers, but it was good kind of shivers, where you feel happy and scared at the same time. When Mrs. Brisbane stopped reading, my friends all begged for more. I'd like to read another chapter, she said, but I don't think there's time. Just then the bell rang, announcing the end of school. The day had gone so quickly, none of us had noticed. Not even Wait for the Bell Garth, who was always the first one heading for the door. Usually after school was finished for the day, I looked forward to Aldo's arrival. It was the high point of my evening. But that night I was anxious for Aldo's visit to be over as fast as possible. For one thing, I liked regular Aldo better than Pirate Aldo, despite his hornpipe dance. For another thing, I was still thinking about Treasure Island and Long John Silver and Jim Hawkins, the boy who went to sea. I stared out the window until I saw Aldo's car pull out of the parking lot. Then I threw open the door to my cage, slid down the table leg, and zoomed across the floor. I was so excited, I almost forgot to tell Og what I was doing. I felt a little guilty having so much fun without him, but I couldn't resist the chance to see that movie again. I squeezed under the library door and headed straight for the remote control. I punched it and boom, the monitor lit up. I was already set to sail on the open sea. I was so surprised when instead of a pirate movie, there was some kind of program about how the human eye works. I guess Mr. Fitch had showed it to some other class. I must admit, I learned a lot about the cornea and the iris and cones and rods. But believe me, it was nothing like sailing to Treasure Island. Keep your eyes open, mateys. There may be rough seas ahead. From Jolly Roger's Guide to Life by I.C. Waters. I hope you enjoyed this chapter and you're ready for the next one. Say goodbye.